Hi everyone, in this time-lapse tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to draw white fur in graphite by showing you a Westie portrait that I did a few years ago. So let's jump into the first top tip, and that is that white fur is never truly white. If you look at a reference photo and you have that up against a white background and you create a colour swatch, you can clearly see that there are many additional colours that are reflecting in that white fur. So even though with graphite we traditionally work on white paper, you can still see here how much of the darker layer I'm having to build up here, even though this is a Westie. So this fur we always think of as being white, but it's never really truly white. So that's my first tip. So my second biggest tip is to build up those values gradually. Now you can see here this is a perfect example of where I'm using my darker pencils over the top of my lighter layers. Now this is going to typically be the case for most fur types. This is how I do like to work with graphite in most cases. But with white fur it's even more so, because I don't want to make my base layers too dark for fear of not being able to lighten them back up. I don't want to end up then creating a dark grey dog, or worst case a black looking dog with more of a lighter shine. I do want to make sure that when this portrait is finished it looks like a West Highland Terrier and does have that white fur appearance. Another consideration as well is when you're building up your values is you want to be focusing on the fur direction, the fur length and fur thickness. Now this is something that I talk about in every single tutorial here on YouTube, regardless of the medium that I'm working in. These three things are ultimately going to affect the type of texture that you're creating in your drawing. So for instance, a West Highland Terrier, depending on when that dog had a haircut, as we know they do regularly get trimmed, the length of the pencil strokes that we create are going to be really unique to that one reference photo. In this instance here, Alfie had quite a long coat, so I had to make sure that I lengthened my pencil strokes to replicate that fur texture. Now as well as the fur length, the fur direction is so important. This is really being determined by the underlying bone and muscular structure. So take the fur here that I'm working on that's sort of sweeping over towards the right ear. If I make these pencil strokes too vertical, I'm going to make Alfie's head look very narrow. If I make them too horizontal and they go from left to right, then I'm going to make his head look really wide. I have to make sure that every single pencil stroke I draw has a degree of curvature in the middle. This is going to really help to build up that natural flow of the fur. Now these two things usually go hand in hand, so the longer the fur, like this Westie, you are then going to have more curvature within those longer pencil strokes. Not all the time, again it's going to be unique to that one texture that we're drawing, but certainly for something like this where you've got a longer coat that's a bit softer and free flowing, you are going to have more curvature in the middle. So the pencil strokes that we're creating here do need to be very precise. The fur direction will ultimately change what this dog looks like, and of course that's not what we want. We want to go for as photorealistic as we possibly can. So before I move on to the muzzle, if the tips and techniques that I've shared in this video so far have been useful, I would really appreciate it if you could give the video a thumbs up, because it makes a real difference. If you'd also like to keep notified of the content I upload, hit the subscribe and the bell button. I am also making graphite tutorials so that I can then add a graphite tier to my Patreon channel. My Patreon already has pastel and acrylic tutorials. Everything is significantly slower, often in real time, with a voiceover while I'm working, so every single stage is included and thoroughly explained. Now I am building up a library of content in Graphite so that there is tutorials immediately available when that tier goes live. So what I'll do is when my Graphite tier is active and live on Patreon, I will put a pinned comment on this video and all of my Graphite tutorials here on YouTube so that you can keep an eye out of when that does go live. But of course all of the newer content that I'm creating for Patreon, I will have time-lapse versions of those tutorials which are coming very soon on YouTube. If you've got any questions about anything of the slower tutorials, anything art related, feel free to pop them in the comments below. So back to the fur texture. Now the fur on the muzzle on the left side, you can see here that it is clumped together. The fur is going to be within different levels. So it's going to be a bit more challenging to look at that reference photo and think, what do I draw first? And this is one of the elements that I'm going to make sure I focus on my Patreon real-time tutorials. I'm going to be able to strip all of these layers back and show you exactly what layering order for this type of fur texture we should be following. Now what I do want to be doing here is I am drawing what's closest to the skin and building up from there. I'm only focusing on those individual layers at that one time. It's really a good idea to be trying to ignore all of those details that are sitting on the top. So if we were to stroke this dog, that fur that we would come into contact with first needs to be left until those last layers. In order to achieve that, we're going to be having to use a mixture of our graphite pencils, a very specific layering order, but also an eraser to do some subtraction technique. Now what that means is I use a specific eraser to create white details. This then gives the appearance that those details are sat on the very top. And coming up here is a photo of my finished portrait. In regards to my Patreon tutorials, my pastel and acrylic tutorials that are already on Patreon, they do focus on the pet portrait side of things and also wildlife subjects, so that there is something for everyone. But the reason why I like to offer a wide range of domestic pets, so dogs, cats and horses, is so that any Patreon members who do potentially want to take on commissions of their own, they can then put those tips and techniques, all of the layering process and information shared in their own work. So that's exactly what I will be doing for my graphite tier. I post regularly to my community tab here on YouTube, and of course when that graphite tier goes live on Patreon, I will make sure that I put an update there on that community section as well. But keep an eye out on all of my graphite tutorials. I will put that comment, which will be pinned to the top, on all of my graphite videos so that you know exactly when that graphite tier has gone live. But as always, if you've got any questions, feel free to ask, and thank you so much for watching.